Hello class. In this video I want to show you how I basically created this rendering here. I won't be able to get into all the details of every last element in this video, but there's nothing new that I haven't shown in other videos for the most part. The big concepts I want to take away from this video, the big picture things about rendering that I try to do, I want to express how it came along is one is when I created this drawing, I want to experiment with some of the organic landscaping tools and other fun features that I've developed over the course of this year and beyond, and just apply them to a drawing. And this drawing was done for a competition that I wanted to do. So I wanted to experiment with those tools to try to create a look that was sort of funky and interesting, that still looked like it was in the computer, but had some rich textures and had some emotional quality to it. That's what I was trying to do with this drawing. So I was experimenting with some of those tools in Illustrator. We're looking at here is Photoshop, because the other thing I really wanted to do and really came along the way was I might have drawn pretty much everything you see on screen in Illustrator originally, and I'm going to show you some of that work here, but I want to integrate some of the great tools of Photoshop to really fine-tune, adjust things, and add other levels of detail and interest to the drawing. So really take the best of Photoshop and the best of Illustrator together into one drawing, which was great. And then the other point I really want to get across, as I hope you go through here, which is I did this drawing through a very iterative process. Obviously, a lot of the techniques I'm going to show I've developed over many years, and I have been showing video over a long period of time. But even here, you'll see I wasn't sure which way it would go, and I tried things along the way. Some I'll show you, some I sort of have lost to time. And I said, I like this, I don't like this, let me try that, and it sort of emerged to the way it came out. So ultimately, what the drawing you see here, what I was trying to capture is I was trying to set a scene. I think this looks sort of like fall in the Northeast, which is where I live. I love the colors in fall. There's some things that are turning brown and orangish, but there's also pops of purple that come out that time of year, and sort of interesting colors of greens, and I really love that color. And so I wanted to express this as mainly I'm going to call it a two-tone color. It's mostly blue and oranges. That sort of sets it to be unique. It allows me to highlight this dusk feel, or really maybe it's sunrise of a glowing window, but then I have these little touches of purple and green at certain parts to enhance just those two tones as they exist. And so again, I was trying to create a fall look. This is early morning, and creating this house that fits into a small village, or fits into a small village in the Northeast, as perhaps leaves are changing and the colors are changing for the season. So that was the goal in the drawing. I also wanted to have this quasi look of having it pretty obvious that it's drawn inside the computer, but yet having some of the richness and textures that you would find in hand drawings through the computer. And so, as I say, much of this work was actually drawn in Illustrator. That's how I can get a lot of control out of it, with some follow-up work in Photoshop. So I just want to show you how I started with an image. Like any drawing, when I designed this house, I designed it in AutoCAD and SketchUp. You could do any sort of 2D and or 3D software like Rhino or Revit or whatever the case might be. And so through the course of time, I designed this house, and I wanted to sort of fit semi-Victorian architecture that you see in villages like this, that we see in this house back over here, but at the same time I want it to be contemporary. Maybe it could be a passive house, so it's pretty rectangular in shape. This little piece over here is actually, if we looked at the plans, it actually is external to the heating envelope, so it's just a rectangle to maximize insulation and air tightness, which is why I have different materials on it to give it sort of, to break down the scale of it, because often, in Victorian architecture, you have ins and outs and push and pulls, but that's not great for our values, it's not great for air tightness. So how do I try to emulate some of these features with some sustainable quality? So that's the design I came up with. You may love the design, you may hate the design. For the rendering, that doesn't much matter, but that's what was going through. Those were the design problems I was trying to solve for the architecture, and you'll have your own architecture that you're dealing with. And so I was putting it on the street, and so I took a photograph of the street just to do a photo merge, and I took it in winter, although I didn't really necessarily think that winter would be the original time. It just it's winter now and it snows, and so that's what's in the photograph. Um, I actually thought I'd originally make a summer or spring-like setting, but that long vanished. I don't have much record of any of that drawing. So I took the photograph. I did this image here. I actually just did a photo merge in SketchUp of my SketchUp content in the background image just to get a basic layout of what this drawing would look like. And then what I did is I actually took another photograph when I was out photographing the site. There's mountains. This is in the mountains, and so it wasn't this exact view, but I really liked the way the mountains appeared and the sun coming through these sort of dark clouds as if the storm was sort of clearing. This was just right around the corner from the site, but it wasn't exactly this photograph. So I just merged, I just cut out that sky and just quickly pasted on here. Again, this was just a template for the drawing. In fact, I ended up squishing a bit of this drawing together in the end of things, and that's okay because I wanted to do it for effect. Now, I didn't use any of this in the rendering. This is just a template. What I actually did is I took the SketchUp model and I exported it as a 2D AutoCAD file, DWG, and that just gave me flat lines. And what I did is I opened up those flat lines in Illustrator. And so here is the completed, I shouldn't say completed because it's not the completed drawing, but the last step I was at Illustrator. But let me just show you this here in a second. If I flip over to this drawing, this is basically the completed drawing, except for I turned off all the effects, and I just will use this to describe a couple of things. Turned off most of the effects anyway. So the lines for the house that we see here, that's just from SketchUp. It just created black and white lines, and I just pulled those right in, and then I just rendered within this Illustrator file. So right on top, all I had was lines. I had no materials, I had no lighting, I had nothing from the 3D model, or I just had black and white lines. Of course, everything else, all the other line work we see here, I drew subsequently to the building. So for example, we see the beginning of the tree, we just see a rough house outlined over here. I just drew that right on top of the photograph to just get this effect of that there is a neighbor. And then things like this swoop, this is actually the pine tree. It exists in the Illustrator file. I ended up taking it out in Photoshop, but we see another one down here. This is that pine tree in the middle of the building. If I jump over to the final rendering, that's this pine tree here, is literally just this little oddball little shape right there. Again, look to other videos on how to draw pine trees. These little swirly-doos over here. I don't know if swirly-doos is a word, but now it is. These swirly, those are the bushes. You know, again, you have to look to another video I have on YouTube to say, how do I turn swirly-doos into cool little textured bushes? The sky is just a plane of gray with a special effect to create the clouds. So we don't even see anything in this basic element of drawings here. Right? So I'll try to remember to post some of these links of these special features in there, and I'll talk about them as we sort of look over here. So if I were to actually open up my layer list, we actually see there's quite a lot going on, and we might just look at this semi-independently. So if I turn off a bunch of these layers, we'll start with the main building, which is really what I did first. So if I open up my building and turn the building on, we can see, zoom in a little bit, what I have here. There were some really great features that I used. So for example, the lighting, I guess I should just talk about first because that is, I think, the thing that stands out a lot. All I use is what I call my watercolor feature on several times. So I actually have a window glow here, but if I have a few window layers. They all provide levels of detail. So for example, this first one right here, it's just basically a gradient of darks to lights. Then I added some light into this inner side here at a different depth of tone. And then I added my watercolor effect here. So look for a video of how I do watercolor. I use the same yellows, but it starts to get these little splotches that happen across it. And I did it again to add some darker ones that maybe these are ceiling lines, maybe they're wall lines. It's so vague you don't know. That's not what you're supposed to tell, but you're supposed to give you this quality. There's something happening on the inside. So they're just using like a little bit of scribble with watercolor, and that's all I did. And then I did a glow So I just sort of did a big feather on a yellow and just feathered it out to add a glow. Right. Some of the other fun features I did was like the textured for the lines. So if you look at the siding, one of the things you'll note is that doesn't come in if you're using materials from SketchUp. So all these lines had to be drawn in. And what I did there is I actually just drew one line across the bottom, for example, and one line across the top. And I used the blend tool by a number of steps, and so it automatically made it into perspective for me. So really, for all these black lines going across the side, they are just, and same with this one, or all these lines, there's just one line on the bottom, one line on the top, and then I blend them together, and then I use a clipping mask to clip out the parts of the material that I don't need. A little bit of extra work, but it gives me the control I need. And then I had to create this wood grain. I want to make this wood grain effect here, which is interesting. Again, I used a lot like my watercolor effects, except for I used a very small scribble and a very sort of angular line, a straight line, to match it all up. So for example, if we come down to my siding down here and unlock my layer so I can get to it, we can see what I've done here. If I pull out my appearances, is I use scribble and stained glass and cutout, and I use it a few times to get different colors. This base is just going to be the base here. But you can look and check this out. Check out my my watercolor videos, and that's how I sort of get this texture. So applied with some lines, applied with some texture, it begins to have this nice texture of wood quality. The same thing is exactly true with this roof. I wanted to create reflection for this metal roof. Maybe it's reflecting a bit of this light off the top. Also this very dark, if this was just a single solid gray, it'd be a bit too gray. It would look too much like an Illustrator drawing. So again, I just used my watercolor effects, basic watercolor. I used scribble on top, blurred it all out to sort of get highlights and dark tones across it to get the lines for the standing seams. Again, I used blend. I drew a line over here, I drew a line over here, I blended them together, and then I cropped out the pieces that I didn't need. Right? Same with this effect for the stonework. The stonework, I don't remember the exact textures I used. I used a couple layers. I just have a base color, and then the texture I can just select on here and check out the appearances. And so I use stained glass. So very similar again. I like to use stained glass when creating these textures, and then I use sponge to get that texture that way. So there's just some ideas of how to get all these textures going. So that was the building. And then the background, I might start with the background here, turn the background on. Elements. So you can see the gradient, that was the sky, pop up there. I have that layer down here. Then I put clouds over top. And to make these clouds, what I did is I just have a gray filter, a gray square on top of it. And then I use my bush or my cloud technique as a clipping mask to cut away that gray to see that gradient below it and give it that nice sort of quality. When we add the foreground trees, they start to cover up some of the sides, so I only had to draw those clouds in the center part of this drawing. I have this mountain here. It's just a simple line that I used roughen on. I used a little bit of scribble in the clouds as well to give it a couple layers of texture. And then down in the foreground, again, at first I was trying sort of a summertime look. It wasn't working, so I realized, well, why not do winter like I took the photographs? And so I used some blues and grays down in here, and I used if you find my video on watercolor enhancements, where I use a lot of scribble to break the plane of all these objects and to use a couple levels of them to add different colors to it, really adds that sort of sketchy feel for the ground plane. And so that was the background imagery. I added a neighbor to this because it's supposed to be set in to the neighborhood, and so I just used that photograph I showed earlier. I traced over it to trace basic shadows. I just used a darker color for the shade, a darker color for the shadows, and then even a darker color to do the windows. And then I applied a texture over it, just vertical grain to it, just to give it a little bit of a quality to it, but to set it back. And then, of course, the most importantly is the landscaping. I added some fog to it to fog out some of the background. I added some trees behind the buildings. Again, this tree is a deciduous tree. It's a great thing to use. It takes a lot of time to explain. Please go find those sets of videos for it. I added a pine tree back here. Again, it's really a simple object that I've drawn, but once you get all the effects set up, you can make a bunch of pine trees really quickly. So there's one back there for my background trees. I also added midground trees using the same exact thing. So we got a couple more pine trees, very simply drawn. Check out those videos, and another deciduous tree up in here. And then all the way in the foreground, I have foreground trees as well to set the stage. So I added a deciduous tree here, a little deciduous tree here, and we can see over top of the drawing I wanted to get something in the foreground. In my original photograph, you remember, there was actually a big sort of tree here, so I put it in at this stage. You notice I decided to take it out in the end because, again, I was just playing with colors to get to this far. I was playing with the location of trees and so on and so forth. So a couple other additional elements I added in Illustrator. I added some people, entourage to the image. I added some bushes to clean up some edges of things. I even went so far as to add what I called snow on top of the bushes and on top of the trees and other elements, because it started to have this winter feel again. It went from summer to winter as I was working. And last but not least, I sort of just wanted to frame the drawing the way I wanted to frame it, so I just added some white areas to it to sort of see how I got it. Now this one was sort of interesting because I kept a very sharp edge across the sides and the top and most of the sides, but across the bottom I let this watercolor bleed, and I even let this water intentionally, I let the ground, or this watercolor effect, break this hard edge here to sort of bring you in from the corner into this image. And so I thought this was pretty good, but I knew it just wasn't quite right enough, and I was playing with all these elements, and I decided to take it into Photoshop because I knew in Photoshop, I was starting to get this image of like the blues set off against the yellows, but some of these blues aren't quite matching, some of the golden colors just aren't quite matching, and at a certain point Photoshop just becomes easier to control those things, and this file, as you can imagine, was getting quite large, so every little change was really slowing it down. Now what I should have done is I should have realized I could have taken each element into Photoshop independently. It might have gone a little faster. What I mean by that is I could have drawn, like, I have a pine tree here, 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 and there. It's hard to see that one. So I got like 4 pine trees. I could have used my Illustrator pine tree, made a few tweaks to make 4 different versions, and then brought those independently and composed it in Photoshop. Separate from the house. I could have done all the house in one file, brought that into Photoshop, and so on and so forth. Done the sky in Illustrator independently and brought it in, but I didn't. It probably helped to compose it, but in the end, what I ended up doing, I say all this because in Photoshop, that's what I did. I actually brought in independently each of these layers from Illustrator into Photoshop as an object. I can go and edit the Illustrator file. These are all linked and saved out independently. They can be updated, and then they'll update in here. So we can see I've got just the gradient sky, I've got just the clouds, and I've got just the trees and the building components. If I were to scroll through all here, it's set up almost identically in layer structure to the Illustrator file. And the reason for that is so I can adjust each of the color settings, hue, saturations, brightness, contrast, levels, curves, all those effects you have under adjustments, so I could start to bring this image more consistently into a particular color palette and control it. So again, if I jump back to what the final Illustrator is, here's the colors. If I jump back to the Photoshop, here you can see that they've been adjusted. It's been brought into more of a two-tone quality of look to it, right? So so we can see all those settings are saved here in the layer, so I can always go back and adjust them. And so I had to do each layer independently of each other. That's why I could have originally compose it in Photoshop if I wanted to. And I think the good lesson is you can have some great control in Illustrator. You can draw things like in the computer that's really difficult to draw any other way with the kind of quality, texture that you might want, but Photoshop provides that finalized touch, and so using the two softwares together can be a great trick. So anyway, I adjusted all of those things. As I was doing this, originally I wasn't even going for the blue and the orange look. At some point I said maybe I'll try it. I tried like a blue and white look because it was originally snow, and I sort of liked that effect. It didn't quite look. I played around. I used a hue saturation and changed the colors of objects until it started to become this more fall look that I began to then. And once I realized, oh, fall is really working the best, I sort of enhanced all the colors in that direction. And really what I did is the foreground colors tend to be more bluish. That's including most of the house as well as some of these trees in the foreground and plants. And then the midground to background becomes more oranges. Of course, there's exceptions to the rule for, like, example, the sky in the background, or there's some oranges or browns in the foreground here as well. But that actually really worked because originally I was just trying to go all, like, everything foreground through the background were in the same tonal range. And it was when I said, hey, foreground should be one thing, mainly, with breaking the rules, and the background another direction, it really started to separate it out and have it pop and really give this setting to be really interesting. I did some other things in Photoshop. I don't have them in Illustrator, so I painted on these flowers to be purple because in fall I love the purple color. I added a little bit of green then to break the two-tone a little bit just so it wasn't super boring. I even painted on a little bit of leaves onto some of these trees back here because, and I did that with just using the leaf paintbrush tool that Photoshop has with the select colors, and I just painted it all in there. And so I started to really get a look that looked quite well. Quite honestly, all that work is actually, I got to take off a bunch of the top layers to get to that look. In fact, quite honestly, some of this is not exactly correct, but this is without all the finishing touches on it. What I ended up doing is I turned off the tree that was over here. I didn't like it. I liked it sort of being open and pulling you into the side. And then I ran things like photo filters. So if I turn this off, actually, you can see I was trying to go all blue originally. And what I did is I flattened the whole image and saved it and made it all orange, except for I then put it underneath a bunch of the foreground stuff. So we can see this layer here was using a photo filter and a hue saturation to pull it all orange. It's all above the midground and background stuff, but so it's blocking that all out currently, but it's below all the foreground stuff, which I was then able to keep as the bluest tones, right? So that's what brought me to this level. And then I wanted to add a bunch of texture and other qualities and continue to pull this together into a single drawing. So I actually faded out everything else but the house. So I just have a white object that's highly transparent, but with it cut out for the house to be able to control how much that reads. I added a layer. I did my drawing. I just took the whole thing and converted it to lines. I have a video, I believe, on how to do that somewhere, just to enhance the line qualities. This is architecture after all, and so I like the line work. And then I wanted to add a bit of texture on top. So you originally see, again, it didn't really come out as snow in the final, but I wanted this dotted quality, so I called it snow. I turned down the transparency for the autumn view, but I just wanted to get a speckled look again to just take away the flatness that can often happen when you're in Illustrator. And so to do that, I did things like I render under effects. I started with like a black or a white, and I go to filter, render, and fibers. And then when you have the fibers, what you do is you use different kinds of blurs to turn those fibers, like a radial blur or a motion blur, will turn those into interesting features. And then to get the snow, I then did texture, grain. I did so to get it to sort of dots to happen. So that's what that added. As I did it, I wanted to have even more textural quality to it and take away the snow feel a little bit. So I did the exact same thing again, except for I used slightly different fibers, slightly different motion blurs, and I did not use grain because I wanted to keep the streaks to sort of keep it like the original textures there. I added a lens flare just to brighten up that sun just a little bit, and I just did finalized adjustments. I just flattened everything just to keep it all, and then I just ran levels, like did auto levels and auto curves just to get the brightness and contrast just the way I wanted to. And then I added a feather off to the left just to soften it a little bit. I'm not a big fan of feather on drawings, but here, because we have the breakdown of the edge, I think it just helps it and adds that next level of detail that's needed. And again, one of the key things, it's not to all sides, it's only on one side. I only feather this right side to the left. All right, and then I just wanted to enhance the building just a little bit more, so I went back to this original layer, cut it out, pasted it, and just played with the levels just a little bit, just to put it in your face to say, hey, this is the building that we're looking at. And then I have this frame, so again, this is just a whiting out just to enhance this edge, the breakdown that I talked about in the Illustrator drawing, because of course it had to come in. It wasn't there once I repieced it back together in Photoshop. So I know that's a quick overview of how this drawing came together, and to reiterate, the big lessons were, one is I want to experiment with these sort of textures that I have been working with over the past couple of years to make a drawing that sort of almost feels like it's drawn by hand, or at least has that emotional or textural quality to it. I wanted to combine these Illustrator and Photoshop together to get the best of both worlds out of it. And three, I spent a lot of time just trying things. I mean, they were intentional things I tried, but I wasn't sure which way this would go, and I'd let the drawing take me where it wanted to go. I turned things on and off as needed. I changed colors as needed. I experimented with textures as needed, and I tweaked things to get the feeling that I wanted to do. So I know this was a quick overview of how to do this drawing. I hope it shows that you can really draw anything in Illustrator and Photoshop, and that's the point. Control your drawings the way you want to, not the way some photoreal rendering wants to. With a little bit of practice, it doesn't really take all that long to do, and the benefit is I can reuse these textures whenever I want, or edit this house pretty easily because it's all in the computer as needed. So go experiment it yourself. Look to the other videos for the details of how to do things like the sky, the trees, the lighting, and all of those things are in other videos for the details, and go and have fun. So with that, I'll end it here, and basically, good luck, have fun, and make great drawings yourself.